Hello and welcome back as we begin our look at the muscular system, uh, more so the muscular physiology. So we are focused here not on naming and identifying muscles necessarily. What our focus is for that throughout this chapter is how do muscles contract? How do we regulate the intensity of that muscle contraction? How do we initiate muscle contraction? The biceps femoris, right? When that muscle contracts, is it the entire muscle that is contracting, or is it just segments of that muscle that is contracting? And so, how do we regulate that? And so, they are the types of things that we will be looking at throughout the next 4 videos, dealing with, again, muscle physiology and what is the process of actually contracting the muscle. And so let's start with a review of muscle. And what I would like to do is have you here in a few seconds have you pause the video, and I want you to create a chart that says skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And what are the characteristics that you can remember of each of these 3 muscle types? We've talked about this, but can you list what the characteristics of skeletal muscle is, or skeletal muscle tissue? What cardiac muscle tissue? What smooth muscle tissue? What are those characteristics? So go ahead and hit pause on the video and take a few minutes and list that out. And now that you have listed out those characteristics, let's go in and let's make sure that you have all of those characteristics. So remember that starting with skeletal muscle, right, characteristics of skeletal muscle includes that they are multi-nucleated. Right, so that should be on your list of characteristics for skeletal muscle. They are arranged, the cells are arranged as myofibers, and along that fiber are numerous nuclei to be able to go ahead and provide the energy needed in order to, and the direction to cause a contraction. Remember that this is the only type of muscle that is voluntary. You regulate your skeletal muscle consciously. Skeletal muscle is also striated, and so you can physically, or I should say you can visually see those striations. We're going to talk more about what causes those striations here as we continue through our look at the skeletal system. The muscular system. All right, so these are your basic characteristics of skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle. Right, what were some of the characteristics of cardiac muscle that you listed? Right, they should include that cardiac muscle is involuntary. Cardiac muscle is branched. Cardiac muscle, the cells are what we call cardiocytes. They have intercalated discs. They are striated. Right? They are striated. And so these are your basic characteristics of cardiac muscle. And then remember, smooth muscle is also involuntary. The cell is what we call a myocyte. Smooth muscles have a shape that is referred to as fusiform. And so remember, they have like these tapered ends. And then where the nuclei is, right, they kind of bulge a little bit. They kind of look like this. Right, so they are involuntary. They have myocytes. They're fusiform. They are uninucleated. And so each cell only has one cell nuclei. And so these are some of the basic characteristics that we have already looked at when it comes to skeletal, or looking at muscle in general, the muscle tissue types. What we are focused on in our look of muscle is, in this lesson, or in this chapter, we are more concerned with skeletal, and we will touch on smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle I will leave for AMP2 and whoever you have for AMP2. We'll go into more detail at that time. So this slide here just kind of goes over exactly how we come up with those names of muscles that you see that you've already looked at in lab. And so as we name those muscles, these are just some of the guidelines that we use. So the direction of the muscle fiber very often will give an inclination as to where that muscle will be. All right. I'm thinking of trying to think of one here that is pretty straightforward. Orbicularis oculi, all right, being one of them. Right? Orbicularis orbits kind of gives that impression that it is a circular muscle. All right, so the direction of those muscle fibers very often are incorporated into the name. The size of the muscle, all right, gluteus maximus, all right, it's a large muscle. Location, sternocleidomastoid. All right, sternocleidomastoid, we know where that's located. All right, it's going to be somewhere within the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process. And so you're looking at somewhere up here in the neck region that muscle would be located. Number of origins. Right? Number of origins. Biceps brachii. Bicep, two. Right? There's two bellies on that muscle, and so number of origins. Location of origin and insertion. Right? Tibialis anterior. Right? We know that that muscle is going to be on the front side, and so the location of that origin and that insertion is going to be on the anterior side of the muscle. Again, shape of the muscle. Right? Shape of the muscle. Triceps brachii, we know, is going to be arranged into 3 segments. I'm trying to think of another one right off the top of my head. Trapezius, right? We know it's going to be more of a trapezoid shape muscle. Right? So the overall shape of that muscle. And then the action of the muscle. What does it do? Right? What does it do? All right. And so these are just some of the criteria that we use in naming the muscles. Now, we've talked about the fact that in skeletal muscle tissue, we've got these things called myofibers And these myofibers run the length of the muscle itself. And so we see this, even though the myofiber is the cell of the skeletal muscle tissue, we don't just refer to it as a cell, we refer to it as a myofiber. And this is something that is common throughout all of anatomy and physiology. We will alter the name of something to match its location. Right? So myofibers we know are skeletal muscle cells, tissue cells. We know that cardiocytes are going to be cardiac muscle cells found within the heart. This is nothing new. All right? So just know that when we deal with skeletal muscle tissue, that the cells are referred to as myofibers. The membrane surrounding that muscle cell, that myofiber, is what we call a sarcolemma. Right? And that sarcolemma is what we would define as being polarized. Now, we haven't talked much about polarization, but when something is polarized, what that means is you have a membrane. And so here's your membrane. And on one side of that membrane, you've got, in this case here, a bunch of positive ions. And on the other side of the membrane, you also have positive ions, but there are fewer ions. And so what this does is this sets up an imbalance of electrical charge. This side over here is more positively charged, and this side over here is less positively charged. And so that sets up a polarized membrane. You have a difference in electrical charge across some difference. And so the sarcolemma, the cell membrane of the myofiber, is polarized. And we're going to find out why that is. That's a critical component of understanding muscle contraction. The other thing that I will draw your attention to is when we talk about the sarcolemma, right, notice this ending here, lemma. Where else have you heard of that term before? And the answer to that is the plasma lemma. We know that the plasma lemma equals or means cell membrane. All we've done moving into muscle cells is to take out the plasma and replace that with sarco. Right, so the sarcolemma is the cell membrane of the myofiber. Right? We're going to see this happen in other instances as well, where we take a basic structure, right, and we again specialize it for the system that we are dealing with. Right? So sarcolemma is simply the membrane that is surrounding the skeletal muscle fiber. We see the same thing with cytoplasm. We don't refer to the inside of these muscle fiber cells as cytoplasm. We refer to it as the sarcoplasm. Why? Because remember that cytoplasm is the cytosol and the organelles. Okay, that is both. Well, when we deal with muscle cells, there are specialized organelles, such as the endoplasmic reticulum. It is not called the endoplasmic reticulum. It is referred to as the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And its function is very different. And so the organelles that make up the cytoplasm in skeletal muscle tissue isn't just your ordinary organelles. And so that sarcoplasm really takes on its own characteristics. That is still made up of cytosol and organelles, but those organelles are specific for skeletal muscle. And so there is a difference, and so we refer to that as the sarcoplasm. Now, I've alluded to our friend here, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I've alluded to these guys. Sarcoplasmic reticulum looks a lot like endoplasmic reticulum, but its function is very, very different. The function of sarcoplasmic reticulum is to store calcium. And we're going to talk more about that in the second video. And so there's going to be more to this to come, but know that the sarcoplasmic reticulum stores calcium. That is the job. That is the goal here. And there's a specialized pouch, if you would, within the sarcoplasmic reticulum called the terminal cistern. And the terminal cistern, again, is a compartment, if you would, within the sarcoplasmic reticulum that aids in the storage of calcium. And so we'll talk more about that later. But know that this is the general terminology that you will see as we move forward. And the last thing that I want to touch on in this video is just some of the key organizational structures that we have in skeletal muscle. Then we will go ahead and kind of hit pause, allow you time to digest the stuff that we have already talked about, and then come back with the first look at how muscles contract. And so we are we're coming up on some of what I find to be the most interesting stuff when we deal with muscle contraction. And let's do magenta. All right. So what are some terms that you need to be aware of on this diagram? Well, you have to be aware of what is the epimysium. Right? And the epimysium is a loose connective tissue that surrounds the whole muscle. Right? And so the epimysium is surrounding the entire muscle. Right? The entire muscle. And then the muscle itself can be broken down into smaller units called a fascicle. Right, and this is what we were looking at in lab. Right, and so that whole muscle model that we were looking at in lab was a fascicle. Right, that was a fascicle. And a fascicle is made up of... No, I lied. Scratch that. We did not look at the fascicle. We were looking at one muscle fiber. And so if you take multiple muscle fibers and connect them together, then you come up with a fascicle. And the lining around a fascicle is what we call the perimysium. And so the perimysium is, once again, connective tissue. Right? But it's connective tissue that is now surrounding the fascicle. And then each fascicle each fascicle can be subdivided into smaller components, which is called the muscle fiber. And this is what we were looking at in lab. This is that model that we looked at in lab. So each muscle fiber is surrounded with its own connective tissue, which is called the endomysium. And you can tell that the muscle fiber, again, is multinucleated. There's a nucleus. There's a nucleus. There's a nucleus. And each of these muscle fibers is made up of these smaller components, which are what we refer to as myofibrils. And those myofibrils are made up of smaller structures called myofilaments. And so you can see that the structure and the organization of the overall muscle is very repetitive. You've got this large organizational unit that's covered with connective tissue, epimysium. And that large structural unit is made up of similar, smaller structural units referred to as a fascicle that is covered with connective tissue, the perimysium. And the fascicle is made up of still smaller, similar organizational units called the muscle fiber, and they are surrounded with their own connective tissue, the endomysium. And the muscle fiber is made up of similarly structured but yet smaller organizational units that we refer to as the myofibrils. And the myofibrils are made up of similarly structured units of organization that are called myofilaments. And actually, we have to get all the way down to this level of organization to understand how this contracts. Contraction happens at this level, but impacts this level. And so we've got to come all the way down to this level, all right, to really understand how muscles contract. And that is exactly what we will do in the beginning of video 2. And so I'm going to leave you to kind of review this, become familiar with this, jot down some questions that you may have to come back to our Q&A sessions with, and I'll see you guys on the flip side.